Imagine being in Britain and being told that a Canadian election was swayed by a company in Torquay.
Searching for the bosses of a tiny data company on Vancouver Island, but who boast of changing the course of world history.
Jeff gets up and says, "We destroyed the European Union. What are we going to do next?"
What are we doing?
Playing a pivotal role in the referendum that changed everything, Brexit. We wanted to hear AIQ's story directly from its bosses. The official Brexit campaign group's testimonial on the AIQ website, subsequently removed, said that the referendum wouldn't have been won without this tiny company in the Canadian backwaters. Brexit campaign group spent £3.5 million on AIQ. So the question is, exactly what did AIQ do for that money, and exactly who did they do it for? AIQ used data to micro-target voters with tailored messages, or, as the campaign director of Vote Leave explained,
We aimed it at, I can't remember exactly, but I think roughly about 7 million people, 1.5 billion digital ads.
Let's start with the AIQ bosses. Jeff Sylvester worked for Justin Trudeau's party, tech-savvy and a scout leader. And Zach Massingham, ex-business school administrator, worked for the provincial Liberals, lives near a little place called Cowashan Bay. When we went to the address we had for them in Victoria, turns out they'd left it 2 months ago. The company is also being investigated by the British Columbian Information and Privacy Commissioner over concerns that people's personal information is being used without their consent, something AIQ denies.
What are you specifically concerned about when it comes to AIQ?
Well, in British Columbia, you can't collect a person's information except in very limited circumstance without their consent. So you have to define what the purposes are and how you're going to use it and disclose it. And so we want to find out if Aggregate IQ was collecting any personal information, and if they did, how did they handle that? Who did they disclose it to?
And according to one ex-employee, when it came to pumping out material online, there was a lot of holding your nose.
It's like Catholics going door to door and preaching for the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Stuart Morris worked for the company for 4 months in 2016.
Zach was talking to one of the guys who was writing a script, and he was like having trouble, and he was saying, "Oh, you know, I don't want to say this, I don't want to say that." And Zach says, "Okay, this is for a very right-wing candidate. If it makes you cringe, it's good."
They used Believe to overspend, and not just by a small amount. Almost £250,000 makes all the difference, and it wasn't legal.
His partner in Believe, Darren Grimes, denies this, as does Vote Leave. AIQ say they weren't aware of any attempt to get around the law.
Imagine being in Britain and being told that a Canadian election was swayed by a company in Torquay. That's the analogy. We are a smallish provincial town on the edge of the world.
He explains that AIQ boss Jeff Sylvester, here pictured outside number 10 Downing Street, worked in Canada with Chris Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, back in the day.
Chris Wiley volunteered for the same Member of Parliament, Keith Martin, who employed Jeff Sylvester.
Oh, I see.
That's a connection between the two.
Yeah.
They set up a Canadian entity, and that the legal name was Aggregate IQ.
AIQ deny this. AIQ say they're 100% Canadian, say they've never had a contract with Cambridge Analytica, and say they're not the de facto Canadian branch of either Cambridge Analytica or their parent company, SCL. But what of the relationship between AIQ and SCL? These documents show multiple links between Aggregate IQ and SCL elections. This unsigned one, dated September 2014, even has Cambridge Analytica's logo on it. Then this glossy document from March 2014. It outlines how AIQ will provide SCL with an engagement platform using SCL's modelling data. An SCL internal staff list from July 2014 lists AIQ President Zach Massingham as head of SCL Canada. Mr. Massingham also signed this document in 2014, an intellectual property agreement by which AIQ licensed data to SCL. We wanted to put this directly to AIQ bosses and thought our chance had come. AIQ developed software and code used by SCL, the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, but there was also much more raw side to what they did. According to Chris Wiley's evidence in Parliament, AIQ helped distribute content during the last Nigerian election, supporting the incumbent then President, Goodluck Jonathan.
The videos that AIQ distributed in Nigeria with the sole intent of intimidating voters included content where people were being dismembered. There's incredibly anti-Islamic and threatening messages.
The way that they put that to me was, okay, so we're working for Goodluck Jonathan in Nigeria. Goodluck Jonathan, not a nice guy. But when you see the competition, Boko Haram, you know, that's just the nature of the
Is that how they explained it in the office?
Yeah.
Goodluck Jonathan, of course, lost. Which brings us to the question, did any of this actually sway voters? Who knows? It did achieve one thing, confirmed one man's notion that democracy is dysfunctional. We told Jim Wallace, who'd brought us out on his boat, why we were here. He'd heard about the Canadian connection, but was not surprised.
I haven't seen a democracy anywhere in my lifetime, so I don't know about democracy. We certainly don't live in one.
He went on to speak of conspiracy theories, of losing control, of dark forces undermining democracy.
Barack O'Brien in Canada. In a statement tonight, the company told us Aggregate IQ works in full compliance within all legal and regulatory requirements in all jurisdictions where it operates. Aggregate IQ does not undermine democracy by employing harmful, unethical techniques. It has never knowingly been involved in any illegal activity. Chris Wiley has never been employed by Aggregate IQ. Aggregate IQ has never been and is not part of Cambridge Analytica or SCL. All work Aggregate IQ does for each client is kept separate from every other client.
And what has been astonishing to me is how from a relatively inarticulate caller to a radio station right up to the big beasts of Brexit, and one thinks not just of the sort of pretend politicians like Farage, but the cabinet level politicians like David Davis. Boris Johnson, I think, is unique in the sense that he doesn't actually believe anything. But David Davis genuinely, well, except in the wonderfulness of Boris Johnson and his God-given right to be Prime Minister. But David Davis apparently did believe that this could somehow have gone well. And so this issue of condescension and sneering is fascinating to me because David Davis is stupid. Conversation that you sometimes even forget yourself. It's like Donald Trump, but on a curiously British scale. So when they claim that the reason, just off the top of my head very recently, Rees-Mogg will claim that the problems regarding the Irish border have been caused by the obdurate Irish government. He will of course claim in the space of a week that Theresa May's position has become so untenable that he's decided to launch the world's crappiest coup. And then a week later, he feels he has no choice but to offer up his unalloyed support to her. And she's not changed one iota in the intervening week. So the man is literally arguing that black is black on Monday and that black is white a week later. And it's not been called out. David Davis, within days of the referendum result coming in, said he would be in Berlin negotiating a trade deal, not in Brussels. Now, that demonstrates an ignorant... And of course, what that comment demonstrated was a profound ignorance of how the single market worked. It was something, I mean, this simple fact that you cannot negotiate as an individual market or as an individual entity. You can only negotiate that collectively. It's something that's so easy to understand. Angela Merkel only had to explain it to Donald Trump 13 times. And that seems to me to be a big part of the problems that we've unearthed. It is the people like you line is, I mean, it echoes around the country, but that's a what, it's not a why. Why is it the problem of people like you or like me or like us? Ask them why. And that's when the truths start to emerge. And the truths, sadly, are built largely on prejudice and ignorance. So I'll give you an example of something that the Prime Minister says now, but which used to be confined to the corners of the country occupied exclusively by UKIP and their sympathisers. This phrase, we can't control our money, our borders, and our laws. Now, I hear that on the Today programme most mornings, a flagship political programme or current affairs programme in this country for all of my lifetime, and it goes unchallenged. Let's break it down very, very briefly in a way that no presenter of the Today programme has ever bothered to do, because, and that's, I mean, there's a criticism implicit in what I just said, but I'll briefly explain in a moment why it's a criticism I actually understand. So, we can't control our money. What money? No one ever says that. What money? Do you mean the, what is it, 0.7% of national expenditure that is sent to the European Union as the result of a decision taken and continued by several successive governments of different political hues? Is that the money? Because it sounds like you're suggesting we can't control any of our money. What you're talking about is 47 pence per person per day? I mean, a smaller part of our national expenditure than when you see the pie chart of where your tax take goes. Is that what you're talking? That money, that's the money we can't control. What do you mean when we say we can't control it? So you've asked them what money means. Now you ask them what control means, because it gets sent to Brussels, so we can't control it. Does that mean the money we send to NATO? Is that money we can't control as well? These are not complicated questions, and I still don't fully understand why they never get asked. But the reason why they get repeated and trotted out all the time is because they're so powerful. It's the British equivalent or the Brexit equivalent of Make America Great Again. We can't control our money, our borders, and our laws. Well, we've established what money you're actually talking about and what a fatuous comment that is to make, Prime Minister. We're concerned about precisely what it is you mean by control, so let's take the word control and apply it to borders. I didn't know, to my shame, before that referendum was conducted, about the relevant, I think it's Femi's on later, isn't he? Femi's coming in.
Or has been on,
well, I owe it to Femi Olawule for bringing me up to speed with what the Charters govern in terms of immigration, and the fact that we could have had much more stringent regulations in, if you really wanted them, which I don't, but if you really wanted them, you could have had them. So we can control our borders more than we currently do. We do control our money, and then of course laws, which is the real reason why I'm here today. Because I discovered about 4 years ago that when someone is screaming at you about how awful the European Union is, and how they impose their laws upon us from without, and have robbed us of autonomy and sovereignty and independence, there is one very simple question you can ask every single one of them, which is this: what is the law you detest so much that you can't wait to wake up on the morning after Brexit and no longer have to obey it? I had Sir Paul Nurse in the studio not long ago, who's head of the Royal Academy, isn't he? But more importantly, he's won a Nobel Prize for science. That's quite a good qualification for science. And he was explaining the impact that Brexit would have upon research in the context of science, for which he's won a Nobel Prize. And the caller like the one Jonathan refers to, within 2-3 minutes of Sir Paul leaving the studio, I had people on the phone claiming that they knew more about science than Sir Paul Nurse, in the same way that Andrew Bridgen knows more about manufacturing cars than the head of Jaguar Land Rover, Jacob Rees-Mogg knows more about the Irish border than everybody in Ireland, and Nadine Dorries knows more about everything than everyone. Oh, Christ, it shows how messy British politics has become that we're sitting here feeling nostalgic for the Cones hotline and defending John Major. I suspect that was the kind of comment that John Major would make in the hope of keeping Kelvin Mackenzie at bay. Yeah. And in many ways, trying to keep these people at bay, these ferocious populist right-wingers, is a big mistake. And it's part of the mistake that Brexit was. We shouldn't have been trying to keep them at bay. We should have been fighting them on their own territory and calling them out all the time, and we didn't.
I want to
I touched already on the importance of making sure that people define the words that they use themselves. And I think you can do that in a very polite way, and it's not an unreasonable request to ask somebody who has used a word which is nuanced and complicated to explain precisely what they mean by that word. The most obvious examples being control, money, borders, and laws. A little more controversially, I think that actions should have consequences. So I can make you all laugh by reminiscing about the greatest hits of David Davis, or Andrew Bridgen's recently stated belief that because he's English, he's entitled to an Irish passport. I told you I could make you laugh. But he was back on the telly the next day. He was back on the radio a week later. I mean, how gross does your discrepancy have to be before you are sufficiently discredited not to get invited onto Newsnight tomorrow or the Today programme next week? And it seems to me that if you are in public life, particularly as a politician, and you have both stated and refused to withdraw something that is demonstrably untrue. Jacob Rees-Mogg tweeted something about World Trade Organization tariffs that was, I'm positively poached in ignorance, but it had been lifted from the Sun. The Sun, of course, because they are to a degree responsible and regulated, a very small degree, but compared to Jacob Rees-Mogg, they're practically in a straitjacket. The Sun withdrew and apologized for that article, but Jacob Rees-Mogg never did. And he's never off the telly, despite having been proved wrong about a myriad of things. So I don't know how you would do it, but I think that if it was me, if they come into my studio, I would ask them to either apologize for or on the record withdraw their last falsehood and wrongdoing. Now, obviously, with some of them, you'd need an hour before you could get on with the reason that they turned up for today's interview. But this shouldn't be funny. It still makes me giggle. But Bridgen was a particularly egregious example just before Christmas, when you would have thought, wouldn't you, in a rational universe, that someone who displays a level of ignorance so utterly profound as to believe you're entitled to an Irish passport by dint of being English, that should probably be the last time he gets asked what he thinks about Brexit.
Completely.
I think we'll probably be in broad agreement. I think it was Redwood, was it, who started arguing with the fact checker. And I thought that was a beautiful moment. That, for me, was the very essence of Brexit, which was a fact checker. Who was it? Peter Lilly. So easy to get them mixed up, isn't it? And that was it for me. That was the point at which you thought you might as well pack up and go home, because they're now going to actually argue with the fact checkers. They've denied the facts. Here's the bloke who's policing the facts, and you think he's having an argument with you. It was and no one's ever heard of him since. I mean, I don't want to be self-referential, but I've, and it's a tiny little protest, like the time I boycotted Woolworths. I won't go on panel programs unless there are fact checkers there, which means I don't go on panel programs because I'm not the presenter. And if the presenter isn't going to pick up these people for the nonsense that they're talking or the ludicrous slogans that they're parroting, you're going to look like the most insufferable prig on the planet if you take it upon yourself to police the panel that you're part of. So I think Question Time, the Today programme, anyone who still buys into this ludicrous notion of equivalence. So if you've got Neil Armstrong here to talk about the moon landings, you should have someone here who denies that they ever happened. If you're going to persist in this model, which I think Trump and Brexit have broken, but if you're going to persist in it, then there should be a fact checker in every studio on the planet.
I just want to ask James O'Brien, why do you think you are the only person that's having this rational argument about Brexit? Nobody else on your channel, nobody on the BBC, The Guardian some of the time, but that's about it. What's happened?
I will accept the premise of your question for the purposes of answering it, okay? I think I know. I think it's because I don't socialise with politicians of any hue. I haven't spent 20 or 30 years clawing my way up the ladder of the lobby. I don't seek the patronage of a politician. I don't need to interview them on my programme. I don't need to keep them sweet this week in case they won't come back next week. And this isn't self-aggrandising, actually, but I think that the journalists that should know better have an almost existential problem with what's happened in the last 2.5 years. I've been very good friends for all of my life with Sir Bill Cash, his youngest son, and I really like Bill, but I would never want to interview him about Brexit because he's so wrong, and I like him, so I won't interview him. But if I was interviewing these people that I'd known for 20 or 30 years, and they dedicated their lives and careers to the notion that the European Union is a malevolent force dedicated to the detriment of the United Kingdom, which they believe and persist in believing. And I've treated it as a balanced argument. It has been plausible, it's been a thing, a theory, it's been feasible. The idea that it is a flush now so completely busted means they can't conduct the conversations in the way that I do, because they're friends with Peter Lilly, and John Redwood might have, helped their daughter get into Oxford, or they might be looking for a quote on the back cover of their next book from David Davis or Liam Fox or something. You've got entire lives, not just the professional lives, but journalists and politicians whose entire careers have been built upon a forgivable belief that the European Union was some awful project dedicated to the erosion of Britain. It categorically isn't, but I don't think the journalists have quite got to the point where they can turn around to all their friends and contacts and colleagues and tell them honestly just how horribly wrong they've had things. Well, think about what it says to you. If you spent 30 years as a Eurosceptic, a decent, honourable one like Cash, not a racist clown like Farage, but a decent, honourable man like Bill Cash, his entire career has been built on sand. And I don't think they're ready to process that yet. And I don't think the journalists are either, because they're in the same boat. That's my theory, but thank you for your very flattering question.
Yeah.
The problem of humiliation and punishment is because of the mess in the Tory party. There is the humiliation of the British people. Sitting in your group, they are not even there. They are not even there. The only who is there is Mr. Farage. That's a surprise for me, because I thought that he was marching somewhere in Britain. And he is here. A 200 miles march. How many miles you have done? 2 miles, you think? Something like that? Yeah, think so. You remind me more and more, I don't know if you know him, Field Marshal Hay in Blackadder. You know Field Marshal Hay in Blackadder? He was also sitting in the First World War in his office in London, and you are sitting here in Strasbourg, where your own people are marching to the rain and in the cold. That is the way you are taking your responsibility. Okay, but I want to recall the words of Winston Churchill, who said, if I may quote him, "Success is the ability to go from one failure to another with no loss of enthusiasm." I think that is a quote of Winston Churchill was absolutely applicable today to British politics, the House of Commons and the Prime Minister May. Because this afternoon, dear colleagues, in the House of Commons, if the Speaker allows it, because that's their system, there will no less than 16 options on the table for a Brexit. So there is certainly no loss of enthusiasm, as in the quote of Winston Churchill. But more seriously,
we must build a kind of United States of Europe. But I must give you a warning. Time may be short. If we are to form the United States of Europe, or whatever name it may take, we must begin now. I'm now going to say something that will astonish you. The first step in the recreation of the European family must be a partnership between France and Germany.
I can say that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, in the name of the whole European Parliament, that we are open to have this agreement with Britain, that we are open to change the political declaration in two senses. First of all, in the way that we can make it more binding for both parties than only a declaration. And secondly, that we can put inside this political declaration a far more intense relationship between the EU and the UK than the relationship that is foreseen in the political declaration at this moment. Well, I think it's time now to look into the possibilities together with Mr. Barclay and you and both houses to see how we can formalize that the fastest as possible, so that in any case what's happened, even when the most stupid thing happens, for example of a no deal, at least these citizens are not the victims of all these games that we have seen the last 2 years. Thank you.
Well, democracy is about informed consent. If you go to the doctor and the doctor recommends something, they need to tell you what exactly it is and what the consequences are. And unfortunately for people in Britain, they were never given the right to informed consent. I mean, they were told that Brexit was going to be the easiest deal that would ever be negotiated, that it would be all over in a year and it would be just fantastic, and that they would have all the benefits of EU membership without any of the costs. It was a fantasy, and therefore it just simply could not survive contact with reality. And what we're seeing now is the playing out of this, really, that something that was impossible has just gone round and round in circles. And it's caused enormous damage, I think, to Britain itself in the process. The underlying problems are that there's a problem with the union itself. The Europeans have been complaining for the last 2.5 years that the British aren't negotiating with them, they're negotiating with themselves. And in a way, that's the reality that people won't face. That really, this is a country which is very, very uncomfortable with itself. You have Scottish nationalism, you have the Irish problem, and then what we've really had really since the turn of the century is the rise of an English nationalism that nobody has really been talking about or addressing. And the only chance people in England really got to express their anger with the way they're governed and their sense that we don't really fully believe that we belong here or that people are speaking for us was the Brexit referendum. But it's a real exercise in displacement. So it's not really fundamentally about the European Union. It's really about the British themselves, and in particular the English themselves, who are the people who actually voted for Brexit. But I think if anybody understands the European Union at all, they understand that it's just a set of rules. I mean, its whole existence is about the fact that it's a rule-bound organisation. And I think the British misunderstood that. They thought that they could split off one country from another. They could play the French against the Germans. They could play everybody against Little Ireland. And that just didn't work. And yes, I think you can absolutely say that there's been a certain inflexibility on the European side. But I think this should have been very predictable. That's the way the European Union works. Once it decided on its negotiating strategy, it really couldn't open it up again, because then you're into a nightmare. You've got 27 different countries. Everybody has different interests. In a sense, it was predictable that they would stick together. Part of the problem, I think, for the Brexiteers is they didn't really believe the deal would ultimately be done in Brussels. They believed it would be done in Berlin. They had a kind of fantasy that the European Union is really just the Germans. David Davis, who was the Brexit secretary originally, said, this deal will be done in Berlin. It'll be done in the last week. It'll just be, us and the Germans. We'll all sort this out. And that was just simply untrue and I think a misunderstanding of the way the European Union would work. For us in Ireland, in a way in Ireland, we've, like most small countries, we've always kind of ridden two horses at the same time. So we've had this very close relationship with Britain. Our histories are completely intertwined and will remain so. Geography is destiny. We're not going to sail off closer to France. We're still part of this archipelago together. But at the same time, I think absolutely, as you say, what Brexit's kind of force is Ireland has sort of psychologically had to move further towards the continent. And I don't think Irish people have really fully thought through what the consequences of that long term are. Do we become more European? What are the implications of that, for example, for Ireland's corporate tax policy, which is seen by a lot of the Europeans as being a very damaging one? So yes, Ireland's been, for the first time, what we've had in the last 2.5 years is that Ireland has been more powerful than Britain. That's never ever happened before in the entire history of relationships between these two islands, but it's been powerful simply because it's been part of the 27. And that has paid off in one way, in that Irish demands have been absolutely at the centre of what the Europeans have been pushing, and that's what's led us towards the backstop and towards what's happening today. But on the other hand, the long-term relationships between Ireland and Britain, not least because of the peace process in Northern Ireland, but also economically, culturally, socially, these are crucial relationships to us in Ireland. And we haven't really thought through, what's on the other side of this mess. And this is why I think Irish people are desperately hoping somehow that there is an amicable solution to this. And what's been happening in the last 2 days is very interesting. The Boris Johnsons and Rhys Moggs are moving away from the DUP. I think they were always going to be betrayed in the end, because in the end, Brexit is about England, and it's about England's sense of itself. And they may, they like the union, they talk about it and all that sort of stuff. But for them, Brexit's more important in the long term than the union is. Whereas for the DUP, the union is much more important than Brexit. And so I think they've become more isolated. They're probably going to end up being blamed by a lot of English people for this mess, which is a bit unfair. I mean, there's a lot of other contributory factors. But I think it leaves the whole future of the union, the future of Irish unionism and people who want to maintain the link with Britain in very serious flux and very serious doubt. And that's one of the things about the Brexit process, that it's had all these unintended consequences that nobody really thought about at the time.
Well, and you make the point.